What is economics? Before we get into the particulars of the principles and concepts and some of the details of this chapter and future chapters and our study of micro or macroeconomics, it makes sense to define this term and have a working understanding of what we mean by economics before we get into a detailed study of the subject. Now, this might seem like an oversimplified way of introducing such a broad topic, but instead of having your typical definition from a textbook, this particular tool helps students visualize and understand what we mean by the field of economics. On the left-hand side, you have economic resources: land, capital, labor. Land are things like oil, copper, natural gas, minerals. Capital is manufactured tools and aids, such as machines and equipment and factories and plants. Labor is the human skills of mental and physical capacity that produce goods and services. On the right-hand side, you have the things that us human beings want, economic wants. Obviously, we have food, shelter, clothing, the basic human needs. And then I just threw in there cell phone services. Beyond the basic necessities of being a human that need to be met, there are many goods and services that we desire that fall into the realm of, we would say, luxury. Now, cell phone service might be a necessity, but there are many goods and services that we desire that aren't necessarily things we absolutely positively need, but part of the human wants. In between the economic resources used to produce goods and services on the left-hand side and the economic wants on the right-hand side, you see an inequality. Here is the basic fact of life. In comparison to the economic wants of food, shelter, clothing, our basic necessities, and the luxuries that we desire, economic resources are relatively scarce. So because economic resources are scarce in comparison to the economic wants of human beings, we have an issue. We have this burden of scarcity. Economics is all about addressing this burden of scarcity. The fact that economic wants far outpace economic resources gives rise to the field of economics. The remainder of this course and any other study in economics is going to address this exact issue. What is the most efficient means? What's the best way to go about satisfying the most human wants, knowing that we can't ever come close to satisfying all of them given the limitation of resources? Let's look at this in a more formal way. So here's your typical definition of economics. It's a social science concerned with the efficient use of, as we mentioned, the limited or scarce resources to achieve a maximum satisfaction of human material wants. Let's take the first term and break it down for a moment. Social science. Remember, economics is a study of human beings in the everyday business of life. We are not studying chemicals in a laboratory like a chemist. We're not studying numbers like a mathematician or an engineer. We're studying human beings and their everyday business of going about living their lives. Studying a social science makes economics an interesting and challenging field because we can make generalizations about human behavior, but sometimes people act in unpredictable ways. Before we talk about the remainder of this definition, let's talk about any society. In general, generally speaking, there are three components to this society. We have households and businesses and government. Those are the three components to society. Now notice, we've broken down these components. The private side or private sector of the economy is made up of households and businesses. In textbooks, in economic textbooks or in economic lingo, households will sometimes be referred to as individuals. Those two terms are synonymous. So individuals/households plus businesses, that's the private sector, private side of the economy. Good old government, that's the public sector of the economy. So economics is a study of how is it to best satisfy the economic desires of society, knowing that we will always take into consideration all three components, households, businesses, and governments, given this burden of scarcity of limited economic resources relative to human wants. Whenever we introduce any economic principle or concept, it is important for us to keep in perspective the idea that economics is a social science, and we must consider every issue from the perspective of all three components within the economy, within society. What does this mean for households? What does it mean for businesses? And how does it affect, or how is it dealt with from the standpoint of the government? The economic perspective. We already said that economics is all about doing the best with the least. We have limited or economic resources compared to human desires and wants, which means we will never be able to escape the burden of scarcity. Scarcity is a fact of human existence. Because we now recognize the burden of scarcity, we also are forced to realize that we have to make choices. We must make choices. We cannot have everything we want. If we could have everything we wanted, economics would not be a social science. There would be no subject of economics. We have limited economic resources, land, capital, labor, unlimited economic desires, which means we have to make choices. We can't have everything we want. Unfortunately, every time we make a choice, there is a cost involved. So all choices involve cost. If we put economic resources to use to produce a certain good or service, those economic resources are no longer available to produce another good or service. Use a simple example, something as plain Jane as a picnic table. Right? The lumber used to make that particular economic good, once we put it to use there, can no longer be used in some other function. We can't use it to frame out the walls of a new kitchen in someone's house. Okay? So scarcity, unavoidable because of unlimited economic wants versus limited economic resources, means that we're all forced to make choices. And every time we make a choice, there's a cost involved. Economic resources, once put to use in some capacity, cannot simultaneously be used for some other function. Building on what we have discussed on the economics perspective and the definition of economics, let's continue with analyzing the economic perspective and start talking about an idea called rational behavior. Most of the foundation of economic thinking is based on the principle that individuals act in their own rational self-interest to maximize utility. What does this mean exactly? In other words, people act to maximize their own happiness, satisfaction, gratification. Let's use an example to both emphasize the importance of rational behavior and clarify exactly what we mean by rational behavior. So, if someone graduates from high school, they have several decisions to make. Go to college, go into the military, or maybe work a full-time job. According to economic thinking, a person will evaluate what makes them most happy, what provides them with the most utility. And by utility we mean happiness, satisfaction, gratification that comes from pursuing any activity. So one young man or woman might graduate from high school and decide that they have a patriotic fervor and want to head into the military. So they graduate from high school and they go into the Navy. And they serve 4 years in the Navy. According to an economist, they're acting in their own rational self-interest. Now, more about this idea of rational behavior. 3 people in seemingly similar situations may choose vastly different paths. So one young woman goes into the Navy, one young man goes directly to a 4-year college, and another young person decides, I want to go directly into the workforce and work whatever job I can get out of high school. The interesting thing about rational behavior, it does not mean that everyone will make the same decision. People make decisions based on their own self-interest, rational self-interest, to maximize their utility, happiness, satisfaction, gratification. All right, a couple things about this that are very important to identify. Number one, rational self-interest is not the same as selfishness. There was a man named Tillman who was playing defensive back for the Arizona Cardinals after 9/11. He decided that his patriotic fervor was such that he would quit his $1 million NFL job, making $1 million a year, to become an Army Ranger and serve in Afghanistan. There's a clear example of somebody acting in their own rational self-interest, but that is the total opposite of selfishness. The same thing with parents. Parents give up a large percentage of their time to take care of their children. They're acting in their own rational self-interest because they absolutely positively love and adore their children, but it's anything but selfish behavior. So that's an important idea, is the idea that rational self-interest is not the same as selfishness. Remember our definition of economics, and we looked at the economic idea of a social science. So rational behavior applies to businesses and to government. In the terms of businesses, when we say a business acts in its own rational self-interest to maximize utility, we typically replace utility with profit. In other words, a business will act in its own rational self-interest to maximize the profit motive. In theory, government should act to maximize the happiness, satisfaction, and gratification of all the citizens within their country. So the U.S. government, the people in the House and the Senate, along with the President, should pass laws and make legislation based on what would maximize the happiness of the majority of citizens here in the United States. So rational behavior applies to individuals or households. It applies to businesses on the private sector side of the economy. It also applies to government on the public side of the economy. Another important idea is marginal thinking. Economic thinking involves marginal analysis. Most decisions we make involve changes in the status quo. In other words, we're already doing some activity, performing some task, or going along with some function. The question is, should we do a little bit more or should we do a little less? Most decisions involve changes in the status quo. Now, marginal analysis, again, will apply equally to households and businesses on the private side of the economy, and it will also apply to the public sector with government. From an individual standpoint, students spend, let's say, an average of 8 hours studying per week the first 3 weeks of school. Marginal analysis involves what should be done as far as the allocation of hours towards studying next week. Should a person increase their hours of study or decrease their hours of study? The basic idea here is pretty straightforward. As long as the marginal benefit of additional activity exceeds the marginal cost, it makes sense to go ahead and perform that activity. So in general speaking, as long as marginal benefit outweighs marginal cost, that decision makes sense. So if a person says, I think I'll study another 2 hours per week, well, the marginal benefit is the additional understanding and learning and conceptualization of the academic areas in which this person is applying themselves. Right? Of course, maybe a better feeling about how they're doing on tests and quizzes and academic assignments and papers, and maybe just some more general knowledge about who they are as a person based on the subjects they're studying. Now, remember, there's always a cost, so the marginal benefits of the additional study have been outlined, but there's a cost involved. The cost is, okay, well, there's 2 hours I can't go to the gym. There's 2 hours less a week that I have to, I don't know, cook food, right? And then, that takes time. It's 2 hours less I have to play video games. It's 2 hours left I have to watch TV. So that decision makes sense as long as the marginal benefits are greater than the marginal cost. Marginal analysis is very important for businesses. They're also easy to identify. When you take microeconomics, they'll actually use the words marginal cost. What's the marginal cost of hiring the next worker? Well, it's usually pretty easy to identify. Whatever salary and benefits you have to pay that person, versus the marginal benefit. How many more units per day can that person produce? Again, as long as the marginal benefits exceeds the marginal cost, it makes sense to go ahead and perform that activity. Finally, for government, government says, okay, how much of the tax resources should we allocate towards, let's say, homeland security, or medical services for people who need them, or repairing roads and bridges? As long as the marginal benefits exceeds the marginal cost, it makes sense for the government to allocate resources towards the production of that good or that service. Last idea about marginal analysis, but is equally important: there can be too much of a good thing. So for instance, if you think about the river that runs along the Schuylkill Expressway, the Schuylkill River where Kelly Drive is, it is not exactly the most pristine body of water on planet Earth. It could be cleaner, but the cost of making the river cleaner exceeds the benefit. Because if the city of Philadelphia puts resources into making the water cleaner, that's less resources available for other services such as fire, police, emergency services, road repair, education. So even though making the river cleaner would be a good thing, if the marginal cost of providing that service exceeds the marginal benefit, it still doesn't make sense to participate in that activity. The last idea connected with the economic perspective is something we've already visited and something we've already introduced, but it's important, and therefore we're going to go over it one more time. This idea of opportunity cost. One of the most important perspectives, one of the most important concepts and ideas associated with economic thinking. So, broadly defined, opportunity cost means the next best alternative that one forgoes or gives up whenever they make some decision or pursue some activity. So, if you spend an hour watching television, you can't simultaneously spend that hour playing video games, or reading a book, or chatting with a friend at some restaurant, right? You can't do both things at one time. So there's always a cost involved, and this is an important idea that economists like to express with the following term: there's no such thing as a free lunch. That's the most favorite way that economists attempt to express this opportunity cost idea. No such thing as a free lunch. There's always a cost involved. Now, you might say to yourself, wait, how about if some restaurant around here, so around the Norristown area, the Philadelphia area, decides to provide me and my students a free lunch? We can all come in next Wednesday, order whatever we want, food and drink off the menu, and we don't pay a red cent for any of the food that we eat and the drink that we consume. And you say, well, doesn't that violate the idea of no such thing as a free lunch? Well, to the economist, no, it does not violate the idea that there's no such thing as a free lunch, because when we say cost, there's always a cost to society. Economic resources are necessary to provide that lunch. And once the resources are deployed to provide us lunch, they're no longer available for anyone else. So if you think about the energy involved with keeping that restaurant warm in the winter and cold in the summer, and the waiters and waitresses and the staff and the bus boys and the maitre d', right, and the manager, if they're serving us, they can't simultaneously be serving other people. And if you think about the food itself, obviously once it's served to us, it can't be consumed by someone else. And you think about, how did the food get there? Well, there was natural gas or oil, some type of energy resources produced that were necessary to provide that transportation service. That's what we mean by there is always a cost. Always a cost. Maybe not a cost to us, but a cost to society. Once resources are deployed to produce a certain goods and service, those resources are no longer available to produce another good or service. So, we talked about the idea of the cost of attending college. If you're in college, you can't simultaneously be working a full-time job if you're at a 4-year university, right? Let's take another question. See how you're following this particular idea of opportunity cost. There is a bag for sale, the perfect bag that you have in mind to carry around all of your school supplies, and it's at It's at the campus bookstore, and you can walk right down 2 minutes to the campus bookstore and pick it up today, and it's for sale for $80. Now you check and you realize that the same book bag is for sale at the mall down the road, but it takes exactly 15 minutes to get to the mall. So you say to yourself, all right, is it worth me driving 15 minutes to save $10? Now, that all depends on who you are, the value of your time, what else you could be doing, what other commitments you have. But let's assume that, for sake of argument, we all agree that it's worth driving the extra time to the different store, not the campus store, the one off campus at the mall, to save $10. Okay, so the book bag was $80 on campus, $70 at the mall. Therefore, it makes sense to go ahead and drive to save that $10. What about a tablet or laptop? Let's assume that the tablet or laptop is for sale for $510 on campus, and it's for sale at the same exact mall for $500. So if you buy it on campus, it costs you $510, and it's the exact piece of technological equipment you need to help you through your semester with all your work. So if you take the time to drive off campus, you can save $10. Do you think it's still worth it when the price difference is between $500 versus $510? To an economist, the $10 that you save is the exact same regardless of the price of the item in question, because the opportunity cost has not changed. It's a matter of driving the same distance to save the same amount of money. So, therefore, the opportunity cost of both items is the exact same, because it's the exact next best alternative that one forgoes or gives up. It is important for you to follow this idea of opportunity cost and this principle, something we will be following along with the remainder of our semester.